The notification sound from my phone cut through the boardroom silence like a blade. 50 executives in tailored suits turned their heads as I fumbled to silence it, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. But when I saw the caller ID, my blood froze. Dad, the man who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, was calling during the most important presentation of my life, the final pitch for a $50 million Pentagon defense contract that could change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I let it go to voicemail and tried to refocus on the sea of skeptical faces staring back at me. These weren't just any executives. They were the decision makers from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing. Giants in the defense industry who saw my small tech company as nothing more than an annoying gnat buzzing around their trillion-dollar empire. At 28, I was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years, and the only woman presenting that day. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I've spent the last 6 years building quantum encryption technology that could revolutionize military communications. But none of these men knew my story. They didn't know about the nights I'd slept in my car outside MIT libraries, or the credit cards I'd maxed out buying server equipment. They definitely didn't know about the voicemail waiting on my phone, the one that would either validate everything I'd sacrificed or destroy what little confidence I had left. The presentation continued, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I walked them through our breakthrough in quantum key distribution, explaining how our system could create unbreakable encrypted channels for sensitive military operations. The technology was revolutionary. We'd managed to compress what typically required room-sized equipment into a device no larger than a laptop. But I could see it in their eyes. They weren't buying it. Not from me. When the questions began, they weren't about the technology. They were about my team's experience, our manufacturing capabilities, our track record with government contracts. All the things I didn't have. All the things my father had predicted I'd never have when he'd laughed at my business plan 3 years ago. "Ms. Chen," said Robert Morrison, Lockheed's procurement director, his voice dripping with condescension, "your technology is certainly interesting, but defense contracts aren't given to garage startups. They're awarded to companies with proven infrastructure, established relationships, and frankly, the gravitas to handle classified operations." The room fell silent. This was the moment my father had warned me about, the moment he'd said would expose me as the naive little girl playing dress-up in the business world. I thought about that terrible day when I'd pitched him my idea, begging for just $50,000 in startup capital. He'd been sitting behind his mahogany desk in his corner office at Chen Industries, the shipping empire he'd built from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan. The fluorescent lights had cast harsh shadows across his weathered face as he'd listened to my presentation about quantum encryption and defense applications. When I'd finished, he'd leaned back in his leather chair and laughed, not a warm, fatherly chuckle, but a cold, cutting sound that had sliced through my confidence like paper. "Sarah, you're brilliant, I'll give you that. Top of your class at Stanford, PhD from MIT, but business isn't a classroom. You want to compete with companies that have been building military equipment since before you were born, with contracts worth more than most countries' GDP? You'll never be important in that world. You'll never be more than a footnote." I'd stood there, laptop bag clutched in my trembling hands, watching my own father dismiss 6 years of research with a wave of his manicured hand. He'd built his fortune through shipping and logistics, understanding physical things, containers, cargo, supply chains. To him, my quantum encryption technology might as well have been magic tricks. "Take the job at Google," he'd continued, pulling out his phone to signal the meeting was over. "Stable salary, good benefits. Stop chasing fantasies about changing the world. Leave the important work to people who understand how power actually operates." But I hadn't taken the Google job. Instead, I'd walked out of his office and straight to the bank, where I emptied my savings account and taken out every loan I could qualify for. If he wouldn't believe in me, I'd prove him wrong on my own. Now, 3 years later, sitting in this Pentagon briefing room with Morrison's words hanging in the air, I felt that familiar fire ignite in my chest. The same fire that had gotten me through those 18-hour days in my cramped Palo Alto garage, writing code until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. The same fire that had sustained me through 17 failed investor meetings and countless rejection letters. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting to see if I'd crumble under the weight of their skepticism. Instead, I walked to the projection screen and pulled up a new slide, one I'd prepared for exactly this moment. Mr. Morrison, you're absolutely right about one thing. Defense contracts aren't typically given to garage startups. They're given to companies that can deliver results. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a classified document with most of the text redacted, which is why I'm pleased to inform you that our quantum encryption system has already passed preliminary testing with DARPA's Advanced Technology Office. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's smug expression faltered as he leaned forward, squinting at the document. When did this happen? 6 months ago, I replied, my voice gaining strength. While you were focused on our lack of established relationships, we were busy establishing them where it matters most. Our system successfully encrypted and transmitted classified communications across a 1,000-mile network without a single breach or key compromise. I clicked again, revealing test results that made several executives gasp audibly. Our quantum key distribution had achieved 99.97% efficiency with zero detectable information leakage. The numbers spoke for themselves in a language these men finally understood. Dr. Chen, interrupted General Patricia Hayes, the Pentagon liaison who'd been quietly observing from the back of the room. She was a woman I'd only met in passing, someone who'd seemed unimpressed by the usual corporate presentations that morning. These results. DARPA classified this project above my clearance level. How exactly did a startup gain access to those testing facilities? This was the moment I'd been building toward, the revelation that would either establish my credibility or expose me as completely out of my league. I thought about my father's prediction that I'd never be important, never be more than a footnote. The voicemail in my pocket seemed to burn hotter. Because 6 months ago, your classified communications network was compromised, I said quietly. Foreign actors had been intercepting military communications for weeks before anyone realized the breach. DARPA needed a solution immediately, something that could be deployed faster than traditional procurement cycles would allow. They found us. The room erupted in whispered conversations. These executives knew about the breach, had probably lost contracts because of it. Government agencies had temporarily suspended partnerships with several major defense contractors while investigating the security failure. Our quantum encryption system was battle-tested under live threat conditions, I continued, clicking through slides showing real deployment data. While other companies were still submitting proposals and scheduling meetings, our technology was actively protecting your communications in real-time operations. Morrison was no longer smug. His face had gone pale as he realized what this meant, that a 20-something woman working out of a garage had accomplished what his billion-dollar company had failed to deliver, that the Pentagon had chosen to trust their most sensitive communications to my untested startup rather than his established infrastructure. General Hayes stood up, her expression unreadable. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've heard enough presentations for today. Dr. Chen, would you mind staying behind for a few minutes? The room cleared slowly, executives filing out with hushed conversations and sidewise glances in my direction. Morrison paused at the door, turning back to look at me with something that might have been respect or might have been calculation. In this industry, the line between admiration and assessment of threat was razor thin. When we were alone, General Hayes walked to the front of the room and stood directly in front of me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
She was a tall woman, probably in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that had clearly seen more than their share of classified briefings. Dr. Chen,
I'm going to be direct with you, because I believe you can handle it. What you've accomplished in 6 months typically takes our contractors 6 years. Your technology isn't just innovative, it's strategically critical. But innovation alone doesn't win defense contracts. Reliability does. Trustworthiness does. The ability to scale and support operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. I nodded, understanding that this was her version of Morrison's earlier skepticism, but delivered with the authority of someone who actually understood the technical implications. I know our company is small, I began, but she held up a hand. Small isn't the problem. Unprepared is. If we award you this contract, you'll be responsible for encrypting communications for operations involving tens of thousands of personnel. Lives depend on your technology working perfectly, every time, under conditions you can't even imagine. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? The weight of her questions settled on my shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't about proving my father wrong anymore or showing up the corporate executives who'd dismissed me. This was about whether I was ready to step into a role where failure could cost lives, where the stakes went far beyond my personal vindication. I thought about the sleepless nights I'd spent debugging code, knowing that even minor errors could compromise entire communication networks. I thought about my small team of brilliant engineers who'd followed me out of their comfortable corporate jobs to join something bigger than themselves. And I thought about the moment 6 months ago when a DARPA official had called my direct line, desperation clear in his voice, asking if our quantum encryption could be deployed within 72 hours. General Hayes, I can't promise that we'll never face challenges or unexpected obstacles, but I can promise that my team and I will treat every encrypted message like it's carrying information about someone's child, someone's parent, someone who matters to people who will never know our names. We've already proven we can deliver under pressure. Now we're asking for the chance to prove we can sustain and scale that delivery. She studied my face for a long moment, and I forced myself to meet her gaze without flinching. In that silence, I could hear the faint hum of ventilation systems and the distant sounds of Washington traffic through the reinforced windows. "The contract is yours, Dr. Chen. Congratulations." The words hit me like a physical shock. $50 million! Validation not just of my technology, but of every sacrifice I'd made to get to this moment. Every night sleeping in my car, every rejected pitch, every dismissive comment from investors who couldn't see past my age and gender to the revolutionary potential of what we'd built. But as General Hayes shook my hand and began discussing implementation timelines, I felt an unexpected hollowness beneath the triumph. The victory felt incomplete, like I was celebrating alone in an empty stadium. My mind drifted to the voicemail still waiting on my phone, the father who'd predicted this moment would never come. After General Hayes left and I had signed the preliminary paperwork, I sat alone in the now empty briefing room and finally listened to the voicemail my father had left during the presentation. His voice sounded older than I remembered, more hesitant. "Sarah, I saw the news article about your company in the Wall Street Journal. About the DARPA testing. I didn't know you'd—" There was a long pause, filled with static and what might have been the sound of him clearing his throat. I wanted to call and say, I wanted to tell you that I was wrong about what you could accomplish, about what you'd become. I'm proud of you, sweetheart.
Your mother would be too. The message ended, leaving me staring at my phone in the sterile silence of the Pentagon briefing room. 3 years of silence, broken by a moment of recognition that came just hours too late for me to fully savor. I'd spent so long imagining this vindication, but I'd always pictured it happening while the doubt was still fresh, while the sting of his dismissal could be immediately soothed by proof of his error. Instead, I felt oddly detached from the triumph. The contract was signed, the technology validated, the skeptics silenced. But the angry, determined woman who'd walked out of his office 3 years ago had been replaced by someone more complex,
Someone who understood that proving people wrong was satisfying, but building something meaningful was more important. I drove back to my office in Palo Alto through evening traffic, the signed Pentagon contract sitting in my briefcase like a talisman. Our headquarters was nothing impressive, a converted warehouse space we'd painted white and filled with server racks and workstations. But walking through those doors after securing the biggest contract in our company's history felt like entering a cathedral. My team was waiting for me, 11 brilliant engineers and programmers who'd believed in the vision when no one else would. When I announced the Pentagon decision, the celebration was subdued but genuine. High fives and relieved laughter rather than champagne and confetti. These were people who understood the technical complexity of what we'd achieved, who knew that landing the contract was just the beginning of the real work. Dr. Michael Park, my chief technology officer and oldest friend from MIT, pulled me aside as the others returned to their workstations. "Sarah, this changes everything. We're going to need to hire fast, scale our infrastructure, implement security protocols we've never dealt with before. Are you ready for that?" I looked around the workspace that had been our entire world for the past 3 years. In 6 months, it would be transformed beyond recognition. More employees, more responsibility, more visibility. The garage startup phase of our existence was officially over. "I've been ready for this since the day we started," I told him. "But Mike, call my father tomorrow, will you? Set up a meeting. It's time we talked." That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking San Francisco Bay, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. The Pentagon contract represented more than just revenue or validation. It was proof that my father's worldview was incomplete. He'd built his success through traditional channels, understanding established power structures and working within them. But I'd found a different path, one that led through innovation and capability rather than connections and established relationships. The next morning brought a flood of calls from reporters, investors, and competitors who'd suddenly discovered my existence. The Wall Street Journal wanted an exclusive interview. Forbes wanted to put me on their 30 under 30 list. Lockheed Martin wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. The same people who dismissed me months earlier were now eager to associate themselves with our success. But the call I was waiting for came at noon. My father's secretary, the same woman who'd scheduled that disastrous meeting 3 years ago, asking if I was available to see Mr. Chen that afternoon. Not requesting a formal presentation or boardroom meeting, just asking if I had time to talk. I found him waiting in the lobby of a small cafe near Stanford, the same place we'd gone for lunch when I was a graduate student, and still believed his approval mattered more than my own convictions. He looked smaller than I remembered, more uncertain. The commanding presence that intimidated me throughout my childhood seemed diminished by the weight of having been wrong about something so fundamental. We sat across from each other at a corner table, steam rising from untouched coffee cups between us. For the first time in our relationship, he seemed to be waiting for me to speak first, to set the tone for whatever reconciliation or confrontation was about to unfold. "I got your voicemail," I said finally. He nodded, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he needed the warmth. "I should have called sooner. I watched you build something extraordinary, and I was too proud to admit I'd misjudged everything about what you were capable of." "It wasn't about being wrong," I replied, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "It was about not believing in me, about deciding what I could and couldn't accomplish before I had even had the chance to try."
The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered territory we'd never explored before. He talked about his own immigrant experience, building a shipping company in an industry dominated by established American firms, how he'd learned to succeed by being conservative, reliable, predictable, qualities that had nothing to do with the kind of innovation-driven entrepreneurship I was pursuing. "I projected my own limitations onto you," he admitted as the afternoon wore on. "I succeeded by staying in my lane, by not challenging the established order too directly. But what you've done, it's something I never had the vision or courage to attempt.
When we parted that day, it wasn't with a dramatic reconciliation or tearful forgiveness. Instead, it was with something more valuable: understanding. He finally saw me as someone who'd chosen a different path, rather than someone who'd rejected his path. And I finally saw him as someone who'd been shaped by his own challenges, rather than someone who'd simply chosen to doubt me. 6 months later, our quantum encryption system was protecting communications for operations across 4 continents. The Pentagon contract had led to additional partnerships with allied nations, and our technology was being adapted for civilian applications that could revolutionize everything from banking to healthcare communications. I was testifying before a congressional subcommittee on cybersecurity when my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Watching you on C-SPAN. Your mother would be so proud." The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had changed between us. After my testimony, I stepped outside the Capitol building into the Washington sunshine. The city hummed with the constant motion of power and politics, but I felt oddly peaceful, standing there on the steps where so many crucial decisions had been made over the centuries. My phone rang. Michael calling from our new headquarters, a gleaming facility in Austin, where we now employed over 200 people. "Sarah, we just got word from the Pentagon. They want to discuss expanding the quantum encryption program to include naval communications. We're talking about another $75 million in contracts." I closed my eyes and felt the sun warm my face. 3 years ago, I'd been sleeping in my car and maxing out credit cards to buy server equipment. Now I was running a company that was literally changing how the world's most sensitive information was protected. But the numbers weren't what mattered most. What mattered was that we'd built something meaningful, something that made the world slightly safer and more secure. What mattered was that I'd learned the difference between proving people wrong and proving myself right. That evening, I called my father from my hotel room overlooking the Potomac River. We talked about the congressional hearing, about the expansion of our government contracts, about the technical challenges we were facing as we scaled our operations. But mostly, we just talked, the kind of conversation I'd wanted to have with him for years. "I need to ask you something," I said as our call was winding down. "When you told me I'd never be important, did you really believe that? Or were you trying to protect me from disappointment?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Both, I think. I believed it because I couldn't imagine a world where someone like you, someone like us, could challenge the established players and win. But I also feared what might happen to you if you tried and failed. I'd seen too many brilliant people destroy themselves chasing impossible dreams. And now? Now I understand that the world I knew was smaller than the world you were building. You didn't just prove me wrong, Sarah. You showed me that my definition of what was possible was too limited." When I hung up, I sat by the hotel window watching traffic move across the bridges that connected Washington to Virginia. In the distance, I could see the lights of the Pentagon, where general officers were using our quantum encryption technology to coordinate operations I'd never hear about in countries I'd never visit. 3 years ago, my father had said I'd never be important in the defense industry, never be more than a footnote in a world dominated by established corporations and traditional power structures. He'd been wrong, but not in the way I'd originally imagined. I wasn't important because I'd beaten those corporations at their own game. I was important because I'd changed the game entirely. The quantum encryption revolution we'd started was spreading beyond military applications. Banks were implementing our civilian protocols to protect financial transactions. Hospitals were using modified versions to secure patient data transmissions. And tech companies were licensing our patents to build consumer applications I'd never imagined when I was writing the original code in my garage.
But late that night, as I prepared for sleep in my Washington hotel room, I thought about the young woman who'd stormed out of her father's office 3 years earlier, angry and determined to prove him wrong. That woman had been driven by a need for validation, for external recognition of her worth and capabilities. The woman I'd become was driven by something different. The quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful, something that made the world slightly better and safer. The Pentagon contracts and congressional testimonies were validation, but they weren't the source of my sense of purpose anymore. My father's prediction that I'd never be important had been based on his understanding of importance as recognition from established power structures. But real importance, I'd learned, came from solving problems that mattered, from building solutions that protected people who would never know my name. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the encrypted messages our quantum systems would transmit that night. Communications between soldiers and their families, between commanders coordinating humanitarian missions, between allies sharing intelligence that could prevent attacks or save lives. My father had been wrong about what I could accomplish, but he'd been right about one thing. The defense industry wasn't a place for naive idealism or simple ambition. It was a place where failure had consequences measured in lives rather than just profits, where the responsibility of protection was as heavy as any medal or recognition. 3 years after walking out of his office, I'd finally become the person I'd always known I could be, not because I'd proven him wrong, but because I'd discovered what it meant to be truly important in a world that needed people willing to solve the hardest problems, regardless of whether anyone would ever thank them for it. The next morning, I flew back to Austin to continue the work that had become my life's mission. The Pentagon contract was just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape how the world protected its most sensitive information. And somewhere in Taiwan, my father was reading articles about quantum encryption applications, finally understanding the world his daughter had chosen to change. The Austin headquarters of Quantum Shield Technologies hummed with the controlled chaos of rapid expansion. What had been a converted warehouse 6 months ago now housed 3 floors of pristine laboratories, secure server rooms, and open-plan workspaces where the brightest minds in cryptography bent over keyboards and whiteboards covered in equations that looked like abstract art to untrained eyes. I stood in my corner office on the 3rd floor, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as new employees streamed through the main entrance below. We'd grown from 11 people to over 400 in less than a year, and the growing pains were becoming impossible to ignore. The Pentagon contract had been just the beginning. Now we were juggling classified projects for the CIA, NSA, and 3 different branches of the military, each with their own security requirements and impossible deadlines. My assistant knocked on the glass door, her expression carrying the particular strain that meant another crisis was brewing. Elena Rodriguez had joined us from Apple 6 months ago, drawn by the opportunity to be part of something revolutionary rather than just another product iteration. She'd quickly become indispensable, managing the delicate dance between government clients who couldn't discuss their requirements in detail and engineers who needed precise specifications to build effective solutions. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation," she said, closing the door behind her with the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. "The Navy project timeline just got moved up by 3 months. They need full deployment capabilities by December instead of March." I set down my coffee cup and turned away from the window. December was 8 weeks away. The Navy's quantum communication system was our most complex project yet. A network that could securely connect nuclear submarines to surface command centers without revealing their positions to hostile surveillance. The technical challenges were staggering, requiring innovations in quantum entanglement that pushed the boundaries of current physics understanding. "What's driving the acceleration?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve classified intelligence I wasn't cleared to receive. Admiral Stevens said only that geopolitical developments had made secure submarine communications a higher priority. He'll be here Thursday to discuss resource allocation. Elena handed me a tablet displaying project timelines that now looked like abstract expressionist paintings, red deadline markers overlapping in chaotic patterns that would have been comical if they didn't represent millions of dollars in contracts and the potential security implications of delayed military communications. I scrolled through the data, my mind already calculating the resource shifts we'd need to make this work. The submarine project would require pulling our best quantum physicists off other assignments, potentially delaying civilian applications that could generate significant revenue. But military contracts took precedence, especially when admirals started using phrases like geopolitical developments. "Schedule an all-hands meeting for this afternoon," I decided. "We're going to need everyone working on this, and they deserve to understand why we're about to enter crisis mode."
The meeting convened in our largest conference room, a space that seemed absurdly oversized when we'd first moved into the building, but now felt cramped with over 100 key personnel crowded around tables and leaning against walls. These were the core team members who joined us from established tech companies, lured by the promise of working on technology that could change the world rather than just optimizing ad targeting algorithms. Dr. Priya Sharma, our head of quantum physics research, raised her hand before I had finished explaining the timeline acceleration. She was a brilliant woman in her 30s who'd left a tenured position at Stanford to join our startup, motivated by the opportunity to see her theoretical work translated into real-world applications that mattered. Sarah, the submarine deployment isn't just about speeding up development. We're talking about installing quantum communication arrays on vessels that are completely isolated underwater for months at a time. If something goes wrong with our system while they're submerged, we can't exactly send a tech support team down to fix it. Her point highlighted the fundamental challenge that kept me up at night. Our garage startup days were definitively over. We were now responsible for technology that would be deployed in environments where failure wasn't just inconvenient, but potentially catastrophic. Every line of code, every hardware component, every protocol we designed had to function flawlessly under conditions we couldn't fully replicate in our laboratories. Which is exactly why we're going to over-engineer everything, I replied, bringing up technical specifications on the room's main display. Redundant quantum processors, self-healing encryption protocols, and diagnostic systems that can identify and compensate for component failures autonomously. We're not just building a communication system, we're building a communication system that can survive and function in the most hostile environment on Earth. The discussion that followed lasted 3 hours and covered everything from quantum decoherence in extreme pressure environments to the challenge of maintaining entangled particle pairs across thousands of miles of ocean. These were problems that existed at the cutting edge of theoretical physics, and we were being asked to solve them on an accelerated timeline that would test every resource we had. As the meeting wound down and team members dispersed to begin the intensive work ahead, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with my father 6 months ago.
He'd built his shipping empire by mastering the logistics of moving physical objects across predictable routes, dealing with challenges that could be solved through experience and established procedures. The world I was navigating required improvising solutions to problems that had never existed before. That evening, I stayed late reviewing technical specifications and resource allocation spreadsheets. The building emptied around me until only the hum of servers and the distant sounds of Austin traffic remained. These quiet hours had become essential, time to think strategically rather than just react to the constant stream of urgent decisions that filled my days. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Saw the Forbes article about your expansion. Impressive growth, but are you maintaining quality control?" The message encapsulated perfectly how our relationship had evolved. He was trying to be supportive while still offering the kind of business advice he'd learned from decades in traditional industries. I smiled and typed back, "Quality control in quantum physics is slightly more complex than shipping logistics, Dad." His immediate response was a laughing emoji, something I never could have imagined him using 3 years ago. The next morning brought Admiral Stevens and a delegation of Navy officials to our offices for what was euphemistically called a progress review, but felt more like an examination by people who held our future contracts in their hands. Stevens was a career submarine commander who transitioned to procurement oversight, someone who understood both the technical requirements and the operational realities of what we were building. We gathered in our most secure conference room, a space that had been specially constructed with signal-blocking walls and sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were discussing quantum encryption technology in a room designed to prevent any electronic eavesdropping on our conversation. "Dr. Chen, before we discuss timelines, I need to understand your testing protocols," Stevens began, spreading classified documents across the table. "Our submarines operate in environments that your laboratory simulations can't fully replicate. How do you validate system performance under actual deployment conditions?" This was the question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Testing quantum communication systems required creating conditions that approach the isolation and pressure of deep ocean deployment. But perfect simulation was physically impossible with current technology.
We'd have to rely on mathematical modeling and controlled approximations, then hope our engineering margins were sufficient to handle real-world variables. Admiral, we're implementing a 3-phase validation process, I explained, bringing up displays showing our testing infrastructure. Phase 1 involves laboratory simulation of pressure, temperature, and electromagnetic conditions based on your operational parameters. Phase 2 deploys prototype systems in deep water test facilities that approximate submarine environments. Phase 3 conducts limited field testing with decommissioned vessels before full deployment. Stevens nodded, making notes on a tablet that was undoubtedly connected to secure military networks I'd never see. And if Phase 3 reveals problems that require fundamental system redesigns, then we redesign the system, I replied without hesitation. Admiral, I'd rather deliver a solution that works perfectly in January than one that fails catastrophically in December. Our reputation and your operational security are both worth more than meeting an arbitrary timeline. The answer seemed to satisfy him, and the rest of the meeting focused on technical specifications and resource allocation. When the Navy delegation left, I felt cautiously optimistic that we'd bought ourselves some breathing room to do the work properly rather than just quickly. But that afternoon brought a different kind of pressure. Elena knocked on my door again, this time carrying a folder marked with the kind of official seals that meant someone very important was about to make my life more complicated. Dr. Chen, we've received a formal request from the Department of Defense. They want you to testify before the House Armed Services Committee about quantum encryption applications in national defense. I opened the folder and scanned the formal invitation, noting the date that was just 2 weeks away. Congressional testimony was simultaneously an honor and a nightmare, an opportunity to showcase our technology to the people who controlled defense spending, but also a chance for politicians to ask technical questions they didn't understand while cameras recorded every stumble or hesitation. Elena, get me briefing materials on every committee member. I need to understand their backgrounds, their districts, their voting records on defense appropriations, and schedule prep sessions with our technical team. I need to be able to explain quantum entanglement to people whose expertise is in agriculture subsidies and highway funding. The 2 weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and crisis management. Our engineers worked 16-hour days to accelerate development on the submarine project, while I divided my time between technical oversight and congressional testimony preparation. The pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced, even during our early startup days when survival depended on landing the next contract. Dr. Park found me in my office at midnight 2 days before the congressional hearing, surrounded by briefing materials and half-empty coffee cups. He looked as exhausted as I felt, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and the kind of 5 o'clock shadow that suggested he'd been sleeping in his laboratory. Sarah, we need to talk about the submarine project. The Navy's accelerated timeline is pushing us beyond safe development practices. We're making assumptions about quantum stability that we haven't fully validated. This was the conversation I'd been dreading. Michael was our most conservative engineer, someone who insisted on exhaustive testing before declaring any system ready for deployment. If he was expressing concerns about our development timeline, the problems were probably worse than I realized. What specifically are you worried about?
I asked, setting aside the congressional briefing materials to give him my full attention. Quantum decoherence under pressure variations, he replied, pulling up technical diagrams on his tablet. Submarines experience rapid depth changes during combat maneuvers. Our current encryption protocols assume relatively stable environmental conditions, but if quantum states collapse during emergency operations, the communication system could fail precisely when it's most needed. The implications hit me like cold water. Military communications weren't just convenience features. They were lifelines that connected isolated personnel to command structures that could coordinate rescue operations, provide tactical support, or authorize defensive responses. If our system failed during a crisis, people could die while waiting for messages that would never arrive. How long do we need to properly test pressure variation protocols? I asked, though I suspected the answer would make the Navy's December deadline impossible. 6 months minimum, Michael replied. We'd need to build specialized testing chambers that can simulate rapid pressure changes while maintaining quantum field stability. Then we'd need to run thousands of test cycles to identify failure modes and develop autonomous compensation protocols. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through the implications. Delaying the submarine project would disappoint the Navy and potentially cost us future contracts. But deploying an untested system could endanger the lives of submarine crews who depended on reliable communications to coordinate with surface operations. Schedule a meeting with Admiral Stevens for tomorrow, I decided. We're going to have a frank conversation about the risks of accelerated deployment versus the benefits of thorough testing. I'd rather lose a contract than compromise the safety of people who trust our technology. The next day's meeting with Admiral Stevens was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had with a client. Explaining to a career military officer that we needed to slow down development in order to ensure safety required walking a fine line between technical honesty and business diplomacy. Stevens listened without interruption as I outlined our concerns about quantum decoherence under pressure variations, his expression giving no indication of whether he was sympathetic to our position or frustrated by what might seem like excuse-making from a contractor who'd overcommitted. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate your commitment to thorough testing," he said finally, "but I need you to understand the strategic context driving our timeline. Intelligence reports suggest that hostile forces have developed quantum communication interception capabilities that could compromise our existing submarine communications within the next 6 months." The revelation changed everything. This wasn't about meeting an arbitrary bureaucratic deadline. It was about maintaining operational security for submarine forces that could find themselves completely isolated if their communications were compromised. The risk of deploying an imperfect system had to be weighed against the risk of continuing to use communications that were potentially already compromised. "Admiral, what if we implemented a phased deployment approach?" I suggested. "We could deploy our current quantum encryption protocols immediately to replace potentially compromised systems, then upgrade to full pressure variation protocols as testing is completed." Stevens nodded slowly, considering the proposal. "That would require developing backward-compatible upgrade procedures that don't disrupt active operations. Can your team handle that complexity?" "We'll make it work," I replied, knowing that I was committing us to solving technical challenges that didn't have established solutions. Our primary responsibility is protecting the people who depend on secure communications. We'll find a way to do that safely and effectively. The congressional hearing took place on a crisp Washington morning in a committee room that seemed designed to intimidate witnesses. Television cameras lined the walls while representatives sat at an elevated horseshoe-shaped desk, looking down at the witness table, where I sat with a folder of prepared remarks and a mind full of technical details I hoped I could explain in language that politicians would understand. Representative Maria Vasquez of California, the committee chairwoman, called the hearing to order with the kind of formal authority that reminded me why these sessions were both opportunities and ordeals. "Dr. Chen, thank you for appearing before our committee today. Your company's quantum encryption technology has attracted significant attention from defense officials, and we're here to understand how taxpayer investments in this technology serve our national security interests." I leaned toward the microphone, acutely aware that every word would be recorded and potentially scrutinized by competitors, clients, and critics. "Chairwoman Vasquez, members of the committee, quantum encryption represents a fundamental shift in how we protect sensitive communications. Unlike traditional encryption, which can eventually be broken with sufficient computing power, quantum encryption is protected by the laws of physics themselves." The next 2 hours involved explaining concepts like quantum entanglement and photon polarization to representatives whose expertise ranged from military affairs to agricultural policy. Some questions were thoughtful and demonstrated genuine curiosity about the technology's implications. Others seemed designed more for television sound bites than actual understanding. Representative James Morrison of Texas, no relation to the Lockheed executive who had initially dismissed our company, asked the kind of question that could derail careers if answered poorly. "Dr. Chen, Your company has grown from a garage startup to a major defense contractor in less than 2 years. How do we know you're not moving too fast and risking the security of our military personnel? The question struck at the heart of every concern I'd wrestled with during our rapid expansion. How do you balance the need for innovation with the responsibility of reliability? How do you prove that rapid growth reflects capability rather than recklessness?
Representative Morrison, every system we deploy undergoes more rigorous testing than industry standards require, I replied, drawing on the technical briefings I'd memorized over the past 2 weeks. We're not just meeting defense contractor requirements, we're exceeding them because we understand that lives depend on our technology working perfectly under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The hearing concluded without major incidents, but as I walked down the Capitol steps afterward, I felt the weight of scrutiny that came with success in the defense industry. Every decision we made would now be evaluated not just by clients and competitors, but by congressional committees, military oversight boards, and intelligence agencies whose names I'd probably never learn. That evening, I called my father from my Washington hotel room, needing to hear a familiar voice after hours of formal testimony and strategic conversations. He listened as I described the hearing, the submarine project challenges, and the constant pressure of making decisions that could affect national security. "Sarah, do you remember when you were 12 and asked me why I chose shipping instead of manufacturing?" he said after I had finished describing the day's events. "I told you that I wanted to build something reliable rather than something revolutionary. I thought that was the safer path, the smarter path." I remembered the conversation, one of many where he tried to teach me the value of conservative business strategies and incremental growth, rather than the kind of ambitious leaps that could either create fortunes or destroy them. "I was wrong about what kind of courage business requires," he continued. "I thought courage meant avoiding unnecessary risks, but what you're doing, building technology that doesn't exist to solve problems that haven't been solved before, that requires a different kind of courage, the courage to be responsible for things that matter more than money." His words carried an understanding that had taken years to develop, an appreciation for the difference between building a successful business and building something that could change the world in meaningful ways. The shipping empire he'd created was impressive and valuable, but it operated within established frameworks using proven methodologies. What we were doing required inventing new frameworks and testing methodologies that had never been tried. "Dad, sometimes I wonder if I'm in over my head," I admitted. 3 years ago, I was writing code in a garage. Now I'm testifying to Congress about technology that could determine whether submarine crews can communicate with their families or coordinate rescue operations if something goes wrong. Being in over your head isn't the problem. Pretending you're not is the problem. The fact that you understand the responsibility, that you worry about getting it right, that's what makes you the right person for this job. After we hung up, I sat by the hotel window watching late-night traffic move through the nation's capital. Somewhere beneath the ocean's surface, submarine crews were relying on communication technology that might already be compromised by hostile intelligence services. In laboratories and testing facilities across the country, my team was working to build replacements that would keep those crews connected to the surface world. The technology we were developing would eventually protect more than just military communications. The quantum encryption principles we were perfecting for submarine deployments would eventually secure civilian networks, financial systems, medical records, and every other form of digital communication that required absolute privacy and security. But tonight, the focus was simpler and more immediate. We had 8 weeks to deploy communication systems that could function reliably in the most isolated environment on Earth, protected by physics rather than just mathematics, resistant to interception by adversaries who were actively working to compromise every message that traveled between submarines and their command structures. The next morning, I flew back to Austin to rejoin my team in the race against time, geography, and the laws of quantum mechanics. The congressional hearing had been a success, but testimony was just performance. The real test would come when submarine crews hundreds of feet below the ocean surface pressed transmit buttons and trusted that their messages would reach the people who needed to receive them. As my plane descended towards Austin, I could see our headquarters building growing larger through the small window, its 3 floors of laboratories and workspaces representing the transformation from garage startup to major defense contractor. But the view also reminded me that growth was just a means to an end. The real measure of our success would be whether the technology we built actually worked when people's lives depended on it functioning perfectly. The emergency call came at 3 in the morning, jarring me awake with the harsh electronic ring that meant someone's world was falling apart. I fumbled for my phone in the darkness of my Austin apartment, squinting at the caller ID that showed Admiral Stevens' direct line. Military officials didn't call civilian contractors at 3 a.m. unless something had catastrophically gone wrong. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation." Stevens' voice was tight, with controlled urgency. USS Colorado lost all communication 18 hours ago during a routine patrol in the South China Sea. Last transmission indicated they were diving to avoid detection by foreign vessels. We need to know if this is a system failure or something worse. I was already out of bed, pulling on clothes while still processing the implications. The Colorado was one of our test deployment submarines, running our quantum communication system alongside traditional encrypted channels. If our technology had failed during a critical operation, submarine crews could be isolated underwater with no way to call for help or coordinate with surface operations. "Admiral, what was their operational status when communications ceased?" I asked, grabbing my laptop and car keys while still trying to wake up fully. "Classified parameters, but they were operating at maximum depth in contested waters. If the quantum system failed and compromised their position, we could be looking at an international incident." The drive to our headquarters took 8 minutes instead of 15, Austin's empty streets allowing me to push speed limits while my mind raced through failure scenarios. Our quantum encryption system was designed to be fail-safe, defaulting to secure shutdown if environmental conditions threatened the integrity of encrypted communications, but fail-safe didn't mean fail operational, and a submarine couldn't surface to troubleshoot communication problems if hostile forces were actively searching for them. I found Dr. Park already in the Secure Communications Center, surrounded by diagnostic displays showing real-time data from our quantum communication network.
His expression told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. This wasn't a simple equipment malfunction. "Sarah, the quantum entanglement array went offline at exactly 14:37 GMT yesterday," he said, pointing to a timeline display that showed our communication link with the Colorado terminating abruptly. "But here's the problem. Our diagnostic protocols show the quantum processors were functioning normally right up until the moment transmission stopped." I studied the data streams, looking for patterns that might explain how a working system could suddenly cease all communications. Quantum encryption relied on paired photons maintaining their entangled states across vast distances, but environmental interference could disrupt those connections in ways that weren't immediately obvious from remote diagnostics. "What about the backup traditional encryption channels?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would complicate rather than clarify the situation. Also silent. Either the Colorado experienced a complete communications failure affecting all systems simultaneously, or they deliberately shut down all transmissions to avoid detection. The second possibility was actually more troubling than the first. If the submarine had gone silent voluntarily, it meant they detected threats serious enough to risk complete isolation rather than chance having their communications intercepted. In contested waters, that level of caution usually indicated the presence of hostile forces with advanced signal interception capabilities. Admiral Stevens arrived 20 minutes later with a delegation of Navy intelligence officers whose presence confirmed that this situation involved classified operational details I wasn't cleared to know. They set up secure communication links to Pacific Fleet Command while I worked with my technical team to analyze every piece of data from the Colorado's quantum communication system. "Dr. Chen, I need you to understand something," Stevens said, pulling me aside while his intelligence officers established encrypted connections to submarine rescue coordination centers. "The Colorado isn't just a test platform for your quantum system. They're carrying intelligence gathering equipment that cannot be allowed to fall into hostile hands." The stakes suddenly became clear in a way that made my stomach clench.
this wasn't just about whether our communication system had failed, it was about whether that failure had exposed a submarine carrying sensitive intelligence equipment to detection and potential capture by foreign naval forces. Admiral, our quantum encryption is specifically designed to prevent exactly this scenario, I said, hoping my voice carried more confidence than I felt. Even if the communication link failed, the encryption protocols would have erased all transmitted data before any hostile interception could occur. That's what your specifications claim. Now we need to find out if your specifications match reality. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of technical analysis and increasingly desperate attempts to reestablish contact with the Colorado. My team worked through every possible failure mode while Navy rescue coordination centers prepared search and recovery operations that might or might not be necessary. At noon, Elena burst into the Secure Communications Center with news that changed everything. Dr. Chen, we're receiving a quantum burst transmission from the Colorado. They're alive, but the message is fragmentary. I rushed to the communication console where fragmented text was appearing on screens as our quantum decryption protocols pieced together incomplete data packets. The message was brief but revealing. Position compromised. Foreign vessels actively jamming. Quantum system functioning but cannot maintain stable entanglement under current interference patterns. Attempting to relocate to cleaner water. The relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately replaced by a new understanding of what had happened. The Colorado hadn't experienced equipment failure. They'd encountered deliberate signal jamming sophisticated enough to disrupt quantum entanglement without triggering our fail-safe protocols. Someone had developed countermeasures specifically designed to interfere with our quantum communication system. Admiral Stevens studied the fragmentary message with the expression of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. Dr. Chen, if hostile forces have developed quantum jamming capabilities, every submarine using your communication system could be vulnerable to the same attack. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We'd spent 2 years developing what we believed was unbreakable quantum encryption, only to discover that adversaries had been developing countermeasures in parallel. The technology that was supposed to provide absolute communication security had become a vulnerability that could expose submarine operations to detection and interference by foreign naval forces. Admiral, we need to understand exactly what kind of interference the Colorado encountered, I said, my mind already racing through potential solutions. If we can analyze the jamming signatures, we might be able to develop adaptive protocols that maintain quantum entanglement even under active countermeasures. The next message from the Colorado arrived 4 hours later, transmitted in short quantum bursts that managed to penetrate the interference long enough to deliver critical intelligence. The submarine had identified 3 foreign vessels operating in coordinated patterns designed to create overlapping jamming fields that could disrupt quantum communication across wide areas of ocean. More troubling, the jamming signatures suggested knowledge of our specific quantum encryption protocols that should have been classified beyond the reach of foreign intelligence services. Someone either penetrated our security or developed parallel quantum communication technology sophisticated enough to interfere with our systems. That evening, I found myself in the most secure briefing room at our headquarters, facing a delegation of officials whose security clearances exceeded my own and whose questions probed areas of quantum physics that pushed the boundaries of current understanding. The Colorado situation had escalated from a communication failure to a potential intelligence breach that could compromise multiple ongoing operations. Dr. Chen, we need to know how foreign forces could have obtained detailed knowledge of your quantum encryption protocols, said a woman whose credentials I wasn't allowed to see, but whose authority was obvious from how other officials deferred to her questions. Our quantum encryption mathematics are based on fundamental physics principles that are publicly available in academic literature, but the specific implementation protocols we developed for military applications are classified and restricted to personnel with appropriate clearances.
Then how do you explain jamming signatures that precisely target the quantum frequencies your system uses for entanglement maintenance? The question struck at the heart of my worst fears about rapid expansion in the defense industry. In our rush to scale operations and meet accelerated deployment timelines, Had we somehow compromised the security protocols that protected our most sensitive technology? Had foreign intelligence services penetrated our organization, or had they simply developed quantum countermeasures sophisticated enough to interfere with any quantum communication system? Ma'am, there are two possibilities, I said, forcing myself to think analytically rather than defensively. Either our security has been compromised, or foreign research programs have developed quantum interference capabilities that don't require detailed knowledge of our specific protocols. I recommend we investigate both possibilities simultaneously. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 weeks and involved security reviews that examined every aspect of our operations, from hiring practices to network security protocols. Federal investigators interviewed employees, audited our classified document handling procedures, and subjected our facilities to electronic surveillance sweeps that detected monitoring devices I didn't know existed. During this period, the Colorado remained on station in the South China Sea, communicating through brief quantum bursts whenever interference patterns permitted transmission. Each message provided additional intelligence about foreign jamming capabilities, while our engineers worked frantically to develop countermeasures that could restore reliable communication. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sharma, our quantum physics researcher, approached me with theoretical calculations that suggested the jamming wasn't targeting our quantum encryption directly, but instead interfering with the electromagnetic fields that maintained quantum entanglement across long distances. Sarah, what if the foreign vessels aren't trying to break our encryption? She suggested during a late-night technical review session. What if they're simply creating enough electromagnetic interference to destabilize the quantum states that our communication system depends on? The distinction was crucial. Breaking quantum encryption would require understanding our specific protocols and developing countermeasures tailored to our system architecture. But destabilizing quantum entanglement could be accomplished through brute force electromagnetic interference that would disrupt any quantum communication system, regardless of its specific implementation. Priya, if you're right, then we're not dealing with an intelligence breach, I said, relief flooding through me as the implications became clear. We're dealing with adversaries who developed general-purpose quantum interference capabilities that work against any quantum communication system. The solution, when we found it, was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to maintain quantum entanglement under electromagnetic interference, we developed adaptive protocols that could rapidly re-establish entangled states using different quantum frequencies when interference was detected. The system would essentially hop between quantum channels faster than jamming equipment could track and disrupt. Testing the new adaptive quantum protocols required coordination with the Colorado's crew, who had been maintaining communication discipline for 3 weeks, while foreign vessels continued their jamming operations. The submarine became our unwitting test platform for quantum countermeasures developed under operational conditions that no laboratory could replicate. The first successful transmission using adaptive quantum protocols came through at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, carrying a message that represented more than just restored communications. Adaptive quantum link established, clear communication restored, foreign jamming ineffective against frequency hopping protocols. Recommend immediate deployment to all quantum-equipped vessels. Admiral Stevens was in our communications center within an hour, reviewing transmission logs that showed our adaptive protocols had successfully maintained quantum encryption even under active jamming attempts. The solution hadn't required compromising security or reducing encryption strength. It had simply made our quantum communication system more resilient against interference. Dr. Chen, this adaptive frequency technology changes everything, Stephen said, studying data displays that showed stable quantum communication maintained across hours of continuous jamming attempts, not just for submarine operations, but for any military communications that might face electronic warfare countermeasures. The success of the adaptive quantum protocols led to expanded contracts that dwarfed our original Pentagon agreement. The Army wanted quantum encryption for forward operating bases, the Air Force requested quantum communication systems for stealth aircraft, allied nations asked for quantum encryption technology adapted to their specific operational requirements. Within 6 months, Quantum Schul Technologies had grown from a specialized defense contractor to the primary supplier of quantum communication systems for military operations worldwide. Our Austin headquarters expanded to include research facilities in California, testing centers in Virginia, and liaison offices in Washington that maintained constant coordination with defense agencies whose names rarely appeared in public documents. But success in the defense industry came with responsibilities that extended far beyond business metrics or revenue growth. Every quantum encryption system we deployed protected communications that could determine the outcomes of military operations, the safety of personnel in hostile environments, and the security of intelligence that shaped national policy decisions. The weight of that responsibility became personal when I received a letter from Commander Lisa Rodriguez, the captain of the USS Colorado. She wrote about the 3 weeks her crew had spent isolated underwater while foreign vessels attempted to compromise their communications, and how the restoration of quantum communication had enabled them to complete their intelligence gathering mission and return safely to port. Dr. Chen, your quantum encryption system didn't just protect our communications, it protected the lives of 134 crew members who depended on secure links to coordinate with service operations and emergency rescue services. When we tested your adaptive protocols and saw clear communication restored despite active jamming attempts, the relief in our control room was something I'll never forget. The letter reminded me why I'd left the safety of established tech companies to build quantum encryption technology in a converted garage. It wasn't about proving my father wrong or demonstrating my technical capabilities. It was about solving problems that mattered, building technology that made the world slightly safer for people who would never know my name. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the Naval War College about the implications of quantum communication for modern military operations. The audience included submarine commanders, intelligence officers, and defense policy experts whose understanding of quantum physics was limited, but whose appreciation for secure communications was absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, quantum encryption represents more than just improved cybersecurity. It represents the difference between military communications that can be intercepted and communications that are protected by the fundamental laws of physics themselves.
After the presentation, I was approached by a young Navy officer who reminded me of myself 3 years earlier, brilliant, ambitious, and convinced that established defense contractors were too slow to adapt to emerging threats. Dr. Chen, I have an idea for quantum radar systems that could detect stealth aircraft using entangled photons, she said, her enthusiasm evident despite the formal setting. Traditional defense companies won't even listen to the briefing. Would you be interested in hearing the concept? I smiled, remembering the garage where I'd first experimented with quantum encryption protocols that established defense contractors had dismissed as theoretical curiosities. Lieutenant, let's schedule a meeting. But I should warn you, if your technology works, you'll be responsible for protecting people whose lives depend on it functioning perfectly. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Ma'am, that's exactly why I want to build it, she replied. That evening, I called my father from my hotel room overlooking the Potomac River. We'd maintained regular contact since our reconciliation, but tonight's conversation felt different, more like consultation between equals than the father-daughter dynamic that had defined our relationship for so long. Dad, do you remember when you told me I'd never be important in the defense industry? I asked, as our call was winding down. I remember being wrong about what importance means, he replied. I thought importance came from recognition by established power structures. But what you've built, technology that protects people who can't protect themselves, that's a different kind of importance, the kind that actually matters. His words carried an understanding that had taken years for both of us to develop. The shipping empire he'd built was successful and valuable, but it operated within established frameworks using proven methodologies. What I'd built required creating new frameworks and inventing solutions to problems that had never existed before. Sarah, I need to tell you something, he continued. Last month, I was at a reception for Taiwanese American business leaders. Someone mentioned your congressional testimony, and the entire room went quiet. Not because they disapproved, but because they were proud. proud that someone like us, someone from our community, had built something that changed how the world protects its most important communications. The recognition meant more to me than any defense contract or government award. It represented acceptance, not just of my technical achievements, but of the path I'd chosen when I'd walked out of his office 3 years earlier, determined to build something meaningful despite his predictions that I'd never be important. As I prepared for sleep that night, I thought about the young Navy officer who'd approached me after my presentation. Tomorrow, she would probably be dismissed by established defense contractors who couldn't see past her rank and experience to the revolutionary potential of quantum radar technology. But maybe, if she was persistent enough, she'd find a way to build it anyway. The defense industry was finally beginning to understand that innovation came from unexpected sources: garage startups, young engineers, and people whose technical visions extended beyond the limitations of established thinking. The quantum communication revolution we'd started was spreading to radar systems, navigation technology, and cybersecurity applications that could reshape how military operations were conducted. But the most satisfying aspect of our success wasn't the contracts or recognition. It was knowing that somewhere beneath the ocean's surface, submarine crews could communicate securely with their families and coordinate safely with surface operations because our quantum encryption protocols protected every message they transmitted. My father had predicted I'd never be important, never be more than a footnote in an industry dominated by established corporations. He'd been wrong, but not in the way I'd originally imagined. I wasn't important because I'd defeated those corporations at their own game. I was important because I'd changed the game entirely, creating technology that protected people who depended on secure communications to survive and succeed in the most challenging environments on Earth. 3 years after that dismissive meeting in his corner office, the garage startup he'd refused to fund had become the primary supplier of quantum encryption technology for military operations worldwide. But more significantly, the angry young woman who'd stormed out of his office had become someone who understood that true importance came not from proving people wrong, but from building solutions that made the world slightly better for people who would never know her name. The quantum encryption revolution was just beginning, and the next generation of innovators was already approaching with ideas that would push the boundaries of physics even further. I was no longer the outsider challenging established thinking. I was part of the establishment, responsible for recognizing and supporting the next wave of revolutionary technologies. The circle was completing itself, and somewhere in a converted garage or laboratory, another young engineer was probably developing quantum technologies that would make our current systems look primitive. That engineer would face the same skepticism and dismissal I'd encountered, the same predictions that their ideas would never be important enough to change how the world protected its most sensitive communications. But if they persisted, if they refused to accept limitations imposed by people who couldn't envision the possibilities they were creating, they might build something that mattered, something that protected people who depended on secure communications to coordinate rescue operations, gather intelligence that prevented conflicts, or simply stay connected to families while serving in the most isolated and dangerous places on Earth. That possibility, that someone else might build on what we'd started to create even better solutions to even more important problems, was the most satisfying outcome I could imagine. Not because it validated my own achievements, but because it meant the work would continue, that the next generation of quantum technologies would provide even better protection for people whose lives depended on communications that could never be compromised or intercepted. My father had predicted I'd never be important, never be more than a footnote in an industry dominated by established corporations. He'd been wrong, but not in the way I'd originally imagined. I wasn't important because I'd defeated those corporations at their own game. I was important because I'd changed the game entirely, creating technology that protected people who depended on secure communications to survive and succeed in the most challenging environments on Earth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.